share my screen, so hopefully you will be able to see my slides. Just bear with me.
Yeah, looks like that's fine. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Can you see those slides? Okay.
Yep, looking good.
Great. Okay. Um, so I've called this presentation "The Promises and Pitfalls of Activist Research," but as I said, it's quite specific to my work. I'm talking about my PhD project, which was all about immigration detention in the UK, and I'm particularly going to be considering questions in relation to access and ethics and harm in the research process. This is a picture that I took of Harmondsworth Immigration Removal Centre, which is just outside Heathrow Airport. This was taken in around 2018 when I was doing field work for the project. All the other images in this presentation are either photographs that I took myself during that research, or images or documents that participants shared with me during the project. So thank you to them for allowing me to use these images and share them with you. Okay, so just kind of setting out what I'm going to do. First of all, I'm just going to give a brief overview of my PhD project. You can see on the left here an image of some of the detention centres that I worked in during the course of fieldwork, which was over 2017, 2018. I'm then going to look more deeply into questions of access, and I suppose sort of pivot my talk off a decision I made before the PhD, which was to reject an offer of officially sanctioned access into immigration detention, and I'm going to explain why I did that. I'm then going to move on to show you some of the data that emerged from my research, which I think was quite I don't think I would have been able to get the kinds of data that I did had I have gone down this route of official access, and I think it was only through the activist research approach that I took that I was able to build this kind of ethnography. Finally, I'm going to look at some of the issues and potential problems associated with the sort of activist research that I did, and make some reflections on ethics, power, and harm in the research process. So, just to give you a little bit of background to the project and to me and my work. Started the PhD in 2015, but for about 5 years before that, I've been involved in activism. First working with UK-based survivors of the 1994 Rwandan genocide on oral history and arts projects, and then working with an NGO called Gatwick Detainees Welfare Group. First as a volunteer visitor, but then also as a researcher and a campaigner on immigration detention, as well as campaigning for a time limit to immigration detention. So just for context, there is no time limit to immigration detention in the UK. It is indefinite. In fact, somebody who I worked with had been detained for 6 years, despite not having committed any kind of criminal offence. But also I helped to set up a project called Refugee Tales in 2014, and that's a project which is still running today, that shares the stories of people who are held in immigration detention and those who work with them to effect social and political change. Now, something that I observed while doing this work prior to my PhD, which I think was really rarely discussed or acknowledged in either academic or activist circles, was that immigration detention is primarily in the UK targeted at men. So of the 30,000 or so people detained in the UK every year, and by the way, that number is set to increase exponentially with the current UK government's plans to expand the detention and deportation systems. But about 90% of people held in detention, which is currently around 30,000, are men, despite there being a roughly 50-50 split between men and women in terms of the total numbers of migrants and migration to the UK. I think something that was also being missed was that, being detained had what I perceived as gendered implications for men as well as women. So at that time, there was a growing body of research that looked at the specific situations of women who were being held in Yarl's Wood Detention Centre near Luton Airport. So I suppose that inspired me. Since I, and it really sort of pointed to a gap that I think needed to be addressed. Since I'd also done some research on migration and masculinities during my master's in migration studies, I decided to design a project that looked a bit more carefully at the connections between detention and masculinity. So I was aiming really to better understand immigration detention in its primary function to detain and contain racialized groups of men from the global south, to probe the connections between masculinities and state violence, and patriarchy, of course, is very important within that. And to explore how men navigate border harms in and after detention. So my central research questions were firstly, what does a focus on men and masculinities bring to understandings of immigration detention? And the second question was to look at what ways and to what effect men are subject to state violence in detention centres. Now, I'm skipping my methods here because the rest of the presentation is going to be talking about those methods. But just to sort of briefly set out some of the findings, in brief, one really important thing that I found was that detention can be and is profoundly harmful to a huge portion of those held there, along with their families. And that this harm results from instrumental state violence and neglect. So it's intentional. I also found that that detention's violence operates across distinct slow and fast temporalities, and includes harm to relationships and identities, which I frame as slow violence, as well as physical and mental suffering, and even death, which I frame as fast violence. I also conceptualize these forms of violence as facets of what Ahil Mbembe calls necropower, which exposes continuities between historical colonial control over subordinated populations and contemporary border controls. I found crucially that detention's necropolitical violence is both gendered, so it's mediated and experienced through intersectional divisions and processes, but it's also gendering. So it acts on the production and the performance of detainees' masculinities. Now, a central theoretical implication of my work is that immigration shouldn't be framed as a site of exception, where people are reduced to bare life, devoid of agency, or as a biopolitical technology to monitor and control life. And it's often framed in both of these ways in existing conceptual debates on detention. So I argue instead that detention is an expression of gendered post-colonial sovereign power that subdues life to the force of death and injury. Empirically, my study represents one of only a very small number, maybe 2 or 3 ethnographies on UK immigration detention. And it's the only one that focuses on masculinities. Now, this is really important. I think a central reason why there is so little primary research on detention in the UK, and particularly sort of detailed ethnographic work, is because unlike prisons, which have a long history of opening their doors to criminological researchers, the Home Office and the private companies that run detention centres in the UK don't allow access to researchers, with one notable exception. So there is one researcher, a professor of criminology at the University of Oxford, who has secured ongoing access to detention centres for herself and for her PhD students. Now, when I was putting my applications together for and a research plan together for my PhD, I applied for a few different universities. One of them was the University of Oxford. I had a funded offer to do that. And also this professor had a focus on gender as well. So, in some ways it was completely ideal for the research I wanted to do. Doing my PhD at Oxford would literally have opened up doors, in this case to detention centres. I would have been able to roam freely around centres, coming and going as I pleased, and being able to observe and talk to people anywhere inside the centres. It would have enabled data collection on staff, detainees, centre management, Home Office staff, and of course I think it would have enabled me to address my kind of central aims and my research questions. But also, after actually not very much thought at all, I decided to turn the offer down and come to Bristol instead, with two supervisors who were excellent but who were not experts on immigration detention and couldn't, get me any sort of access into detention centres. So why did I turn that down? Why did I turn down that seemingly ideal offer? Now, although I would have been able to, of course, get sort of into the inner parts of detention centres, accessing centres through official channels that this supervisor had developed would have positioned me very clearly as an outsider. I would have been walking around the centre with a lanyard that said the University of Oxford, and I would have been issued with a bunch of keys to enable me to open and lock doors as I moved around the centre. I would have, in other words, looked very much like an officer, or else, a researcher from an elite university, clearly connected to the establishment. And a side note on that is that the jangling of keys and the banging of doors becomes synonymous with traumatic memories of incarceration for people who have been detained. So I basically felt I would have been contributing significantly to the oppressive atmosphere in detention if I had gone in as a key holder. I also didn't want an Oxford Centre for Criminology label pinned to my body, which may well have aroused distrust and confusion for people, as immigration detention is not, at least on paper, part of the criminal justice system. As well as potentially creating barriers to trusting and more equal relationships with participants. Official access may well have also complicated my academic independence, which this professor acknowledges in their own work. So, perhaps I wouldn't have been able in the same way to make the calls for abolition that I ended up doing. So I chose to take a radically different approach. Working collaboratively and exclusively with detention activist groups, such as Gatwick Detainees Welfare Group and Detention Action, and accessing detention centres not through official channels, but as a supportive visitor, and in some cases a companion to those currently and formerly held there. So I did work with people outside of detention, but I'm going to focus today on the fieldwork inside detention. Now, by explicitly aligning myself with activist organisations, as I had been working with for several years before the PhD, this approach, which undoubtedly necessitated very careful planning, partnership building, and emotional labour, I think far more than had I have gone down the official access route. It enabled me to build what I call an activist ethnography of detention, which I argue was richer, more multifaceted, and more critical than would have been possible otherwise. So how exactly did I do this? I first approached the organisation, Gatwick Detainees Welfare Group, that I've been working with before my PhD, to develop a collaboration. Now, detention activists generally don't consider requests from researchers, as they typically have no capacity to work with them, to host them. So it was only through my pre-existing work and through my sort of negotiation of a deal with them that I was able to bring them on board. So the deal was I would give them 6 months of my labour for free. It was actually paid for by the ESRC, so I got a 6-month work placement grant as part on top of my PhD funding, which was really, really useful, and that enabled me to do that. And in return, they would act as a gatekeeper for my research, referring people to me and supporting the research process more broadly. I think, this was really a sort of double win in terms of my project, because it meant that I could observe detention centres from the point of view of a caseworker. So I ran drop-in sessions as part of this work placement in Brook House Detention Centre, and coordinated practical, emotional and legal support for around 50 people over my time working there. It meant that I could make a start on my fieldwork early by developing a mini research project with the organisation that focused on the experiences of people in detention who grew up in the UK. And actually, that was one aspect of my overall project that I think made some of the biggest impact. This situation of people in detention who, were either born in the UK or arrived when they were very young children. After the work placement, Gatwick Detainees Welfare Group and Detention Action put me in contact with their service users, which enabled me to book visits and conduct research with them, with their service users. Now, this reminds me a little bit of something that Sergio said in his talk, that accessing detention centres in this way meant that a sort of basic level of trust had already been created. It was clear that myself and my participants were on the same side, and it was okay to have a side, which I think absolutely would not have been okay had I been walking around with keys attached to me. Meeting participants in visits rooms made it clearer that I was not part of the detention centre, of the detention system. I was working from the outside. And I generally found that establishing relationships of trust was straightforward. It wasn't always, it didn't always happen immediately, but it was relatively straightforward. Participants were forthcoming in their recollections and their criticisms of detention, which again, they may not have been if I was holding keys. I worked with participants over periods of several weeks or months, speaking to them on the phone as well as visiting them, attending their bail and immigration hearings. I was always really clear with participants that my research was motivated by creating change and was not about the simple sort of acquisition of knowledge for knowledge's sake. And I think that further enhanced trust. Now, since I wasn't allowed beyond the visits corridor, the partial access I gained through these non-academic partnerships led me to diversify my methods to try and gain a fuller picture of life inside detention. Many participants were also forthcoming when I asked them to share their documents with me or send photographs of artwork or other artifacts that they'd collected in detention. And this enabled me to collect an incredible array of different kinds of data that I don't think I would have been able to obtain as a criminology researcher at Oxford. And I think this really reminds me, again, of something that Stefan said about both sort of discarding, old institutional methods and methodologies, but also I think the word was being methodologically slutty, which I really liked that phrase. So yeah, I was quite methodologically slutty. Here are some examples of the different types of data that I collected. So, alongside interviews and general observations of detention centres, and just as a side note there as well, recording equipment is not permitted in detention centres. Nobody can bring it in. You get searched on entry. It's like airport style security. So you get patted down, you go through a metal detector. It's the same as going into a prison. You go through a series of locked doors. And you're also not allowed to bring any kind of, so recording materials includes a notebook and pen. So it was only because I was going in and I suppose officers generally saw me as being linked to an NGO that they allowed me to take a notebook in, which in the detention centres that I went to was a standard practice, that they would allow volunteers and staff of NGOs who were working in detention centres to bring notebooks in. So that was really, really useful. In terms of, particularly in terms of recording interviews. And, these were very informal interviews. They often happened over several sessions. so you can see in the top right-hand corner, I collected some, amazing artwork which people had produced in detention. This one was by a participant called pseudonym is Lee, and this image is called "If Only You Could See What's on the Inside," and it essentially was a way to describe, the pain and the harm that he was experiencing in immigration detention. I've already mentioned that I observed immigration and bail hearings. People would give me artifacts from the centre, so newsletters, property lists, work contracts, certificates from courses that they'd done. They gave me their medico-legal reports. They showed me correspondence with solicitors and with the Home Office. And I think, quite importantly, since I didn't have this official access, this kind of document collection enabled me to gain some kind of perspective of from the Home Office and from the immigration legal system, because I also had decision letters, immigration and asylum applications, removal, deportation notices that participants shared with me. I also did some participatory mapping exercises with groups of people who had been detained. So that was one example on the previous slide, that connected, I suppose, geographical, a sort of geographical map of detention with some more sort of emotional geographies. Okay, so yeah, just to briefly sum up this slide, I think what these kind of mixed methods, being methodologically slutty, enabled me to do was to gain really a huge range of insights into people's inner worlds, on everyday life in detention, and I think crucially respond, crucially fill this gap of not having official access, still being able to present a lot of the awful things that the Home Office say and do, and maybe it was right to not give them a chance to try and respond or justify their decisions. So yeah, I put all of this together into a thesis, and I think that thesis was really brought to life by this kind of this data, rather than just a 100,000 words of dry academic text. Now, I'm probably coming to the end of my time, so this is my last slide. I'd just really like to end by drawing attention to issues of ethics, power, and harm, which I think illustrates some of the perils and pitfalls of activist research, and I think show that for me as an activist researcher, getting out of detention was just, if not more complicated, as getting in. Now, I don't mean that in a literal sense. I was able to leave when I wanted to leave, whereas my participants obviously weren't. But I'm talking about sort of getting out in terms of leaving the project and the data and my participants behind. So one question, I've had this a few times from students when I'm talking to them about research ethics. So they asked me, was your PhD covert research? My response tends to be yes and no. It wasn't covert in the sense that participants were fully aware that they were participating, but there was a sense in which the work was covert, because I did not explicitly inform detention centre staff or the Home Office that I was a researcher, unless they asked, and there were a few occasions where officers asked, and I told them the truth. But usually, I think it was assumed that I was doing support work, that I was either employed by or volunteering for Gatwick Detainees Welfare Group or Detention Action. Given the huge power imbalances at play, the abuses of power that have been well documented in detention centres, particularly in Brook House, which was the main centre I was working in. So there was an inquiry into abuses that were documented in a BBC Panorama expose. I think that was 2 years ago, that inquiry. I think things wrapped up in that inquiry last year. So I submitted a whole heap of evidence to that inquiry because I was researching at the same time as filming was going on there. So given those power imbalances, given the power abuses, and I think, really the public interest case for finding out what goes on in these very highly restricted spaces, I didn't consider this sort of, covertness to be particularly ethically problematic, but it did mean that I was unable to include the direct perspectives of staff, which I think was a significant limitation, particularly when thinking through things like race and gender. Another issue that I could talk about concerns the complexities of the consent process. Now, I think informed consent is much more difficult to obtain in situations where participants are, in really often desperate and obviously very disempowered positions. Obviously, in this case, their freedom of movement is entirely taken away. But I think this was made even more complicated by my dual roles as a researcher and support worker. So, I had to develop, a very kind of complex and multi-stage consent process where, the project, my role, consent would be explained and checked at every research encounter. And as I said, there were often many research encounters with each participant. So consent was an ongoing process, and I think that was really important in sort of distinguishing the different roles that I was engaged in. But I would, of course, I would also say that it is, of course, very possible that some people's at least initial motivations for participating may well have included the hope that I could get them out of detention. Now, I didn't succeed in getting anybody out of detention, but I did, I did support people's cases. I went and gave evidence, for example, in immigration tribunals, provided character references. I referred people to solicitors and to other NGOs that particularly, for example, if they were a survivor of torture, putting them in contact with people that together did contribute to helping people get out of detention, but it's not, it wasn't a sort of direct, immediate thing. I took the approach that doing no harm is not enough in the research process. That I think that particularly in situations where people are in such difficult positions, such subordinated positions, participating in research should have kind of tangible benefits, as well as contributing to overall activism and knowledge production. That always felt very important to me. But of course, as I've already alluded to, the sort of support that I could give was limited. And also, there's again this issue of kind of conflicting roles, of people feeling like maybe if they participate, this means that they can get out of detention, and that's that's a complicated thing and a serious thing to manage. So the final thing I'd like to say is about harm to myself, the researcher. I think I did a really good job of kind of going beyond not doing harm to my participants, but actually creating tangible benefits. But in terms of my own positionality and the effects of the research on me, there were some really massive impacts. So the picture on the right-hand side is a picture of my grandfather, Dan Godshaw, who was a German Jewish refugee to the UK, and he was detained along with his father and two brothers in essentially one of the UK's first immigration removal centres, which were then called internment camps. So this sketch was drawn on the Isle of Man in 1940 in Hutchinson Camp. Now, this experience, the experience of genocide, of refugeehood, and then of detention upon arrival, it is a massive intergenerational traumatic experience in my family, and it's something that I hadn't quite realized before I embarked on this research. I think there were spending the most part of 2 years in detention centres, witnessing the sometimes absolutely horrific harms that were inflicted on people in these centres. And I think, taking this activist approach where I was I was operating from the outside, but working very, very closely and over long periods of time with people, this compounded, and towards, it was actually about a year after fieldwork, I had a real breakdown. It was really, really, it was, the effects of this research were, absolutely massive. And it took me a long time to sort of come back to that and be able to come back to the data and actually write up my PhD. So yeah, I think I really just wanted to leave it there. I don't think I've given a sort of overall argument here, but I'm very happy to take any questions that you have.
Thank you so much, Dan, for